Hello and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish and I am so glad that you're here with me today to talk about cross stitch and a whole lot more. My first thing I want to talk about is my scissor order. I am so thrilled to know that it got here before I leave on my big trip. So beginning the first few days of next week, I'll be getting those pre-orders shipped out. Now I know I'm not going to get them all done in one day. I will have help, but you'll get an email or some kind of notification from Etsy as soon as your order is shipped. But I learned something from this. I placed that order just not really pulling numbers out of the air, but kind of looking at how quickly the different styles sold when I first put them on my Etsy store. Now, anybody who knows anything about statistics will say, well, Jean, you didn't have very much data to go by, and that is certainly true. So I fell way short of several of the styles, and they sold out on the pre-orders after like about 10 days. So what I'm going to do now is I will place a new listing on my Etsy store, and I'm going to watch those numbers for a couple of weeks, and then before I get on the ship on September 21st, I will place my order based on those numbers and trying to do a little projection. The long and short of it is that I don't think it will take very long for me to get my third shipment. So if you missed out on the first or second time, you can just go to my Etsy store. I'll put the listing information in with this episode description, and then you can place your order and be sure that you'll get a pair. You know, these will make a really, really good present for all the present giving and receiving holidays that are coming up. So let your loved one know that that's coming. So Sampler September Soiree, September Sampler Soiree, whatever it's called, is in full swing at this point. A good week and a half have gone by, and I see lots of beautiful samplers that people are posting that they are working on. And so I decided I would use this month to post once a day samplers that are in my repertoire. So I started it on Facebook, and then I kind of remembered I also have an Instagram account, I think. Yeah, I do. So I went back and put it on Instagram also. So by the way, if you are an Instagram user, I am going to try to be much, much more consistent in posting things on Instagram. So, you know, go to Instagram and like my account. And again, I'll put that information in the episode description. Anyway, that's how I decided that I would celebrate Sampler September, is to share samplers that I have designed and loved over the years. 42 years of, almost 42 years of designing and loving samplers. So I have a few. You know, one of the things that's happening with Sampler September is that there's some stitch-alongs going on. And it kind of reminded me to bring up this idea with you. Create your own stitch-along. Even, you know, if you just have one stitching friend and the two of you might decide on a particular chart or project and kind of make a commitment to each other to work on it over whatever span of time, you're in charge. You would get to decide, you know, what the project is, how often you're going to talk about it or meet about it or Zoom about it, and post your progress with each other, and how long the whole project is going to take, whether it's a couple of months or a year or whatever. But I guess what I want to say is, don't necessarily sit back and wait for somebody else to organize that for you. You can do that on your own, and therefore get the timetable and the project exactly what you want. And if you don't have a stitching buddy, it's time for you to get one. So whether it's by going to a retreat or joining stitchy groups or whatever, you know, you need to find that kindred spirit. And there are, you know, I can't say there's one for every state, but I want to say here in North Carolina, I think we have 3 different stitching groups on Facebook that are dedicated to the state of North Carolina. And again, if you know, whatever state you live in, if you go on Facebook and you do a search for X state stitching group and you don't find one, start one. It's really not that hard. A couple of people have asked me about my hoop setup and how it appears to be white on the underside. And I just want to tell you, your eyes are not playing tricks on you. I have wrapped the inner hoop, the smaller hoop, with twill tape. And I am happy to demonstrate that in a later episode. It'll be a couple weeks before I'll have time to really do it. I didn't make a video of me doing it on that particular setup because I'm still feeling very awkward with my left hand not being quite as, just doesn't have the dexterity that I am accustomed to. So that is coming. And in fact, I ended up, when you're all done at the very end, there's a couple little stitches that you need to take to secure it in place. And I ended up using fabric glue, which maybe isn't a terrible shortcut anyway, but there was no way I was going to be able to stitch that. So I just glued it. But I'm going to demonstrate that later. Or if you just, you know, maybe there's somebody else with a YouTube video that shows you how to do it. But even if there is, when I get back from my trip, I'm going to wrap another hoop and show you how it's done. I would also say that if you're accustomed to stitching in the well, then what you might want to do is wrap the outer hoop. Generally speaking, people don't wrap both of them, but the whole purpose behind that is that it will keep your fabric more secure. You know, one of the things that I see often and hear often in classes is that the lingo that we cross-stitchers use can be very confusing to beginners especially. Frankly, I think even some long-term or medium-range stitchers can misuse some lingo, which I think adds to the confusion for the newbies. So one of the things I just want to point out to you is when we talk about over 1 stitching and over 2 stitching, that only applies to thread count fabrics, whether it's an even weave like Lugana or Jobelin or any one of the linens. If you're stitching over 1 or over 2, that applies to those sort of thread count fabrics. When you're stitching on Aida, you're placing 1 full cross stitch in each one of the squares. So technically, a person might say, well, that's like over 1 stitching. Somebody else might say, well, no, it's more like over 2 stitching, because traditionally when you're stitching on linen and stitching it over 2, you're also making 1X in a square that's made of 2 threads crossing 2 threads. And all of that is true, and all of that makes it confusing. So when we talk about Aida, we're talking about placing 1 full cross stitch in each square of the Aida that corresponds to 1 square on the chart. So just don't mention over 1 or over 2. It just isn't. So when would there be an exception? A person could conceivably take 1 square on a chart and stitch it over 4 squares on Aida. And I say 4 because if you were doing that, you wouldn't be doing, it wouldn't be over 2 squares. It would be over 2 squares, 4 squares altogether, 2 and 2, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. So see how it can get confusing? So could a person stitch 1 stitch over a group of 4 Aida squares? Sure they could. Just like on linen, you could stitch over 3. You could stitch over 6. So that just, we just need to be more mindful when we are in, whether it's social media or talking with a group of stitchers, that we're using the lingo appropriately to minimize the confusion among people that are new to our passion. Also, the other part of that little asterisk footnote is that technically, when you're making one cross stitch in one Aida square, it's 4 threads crossing 4 threads. An Aida weave, each one of those little squares is made up of 4 threads this way and 4 threads this. I've got 3 fingers there. Okay, 4 threads this way and 4 threads this way. There's a lot of chatter on the topic of floss conversions. Now, I'm not talking about a massive floss conversion where somebody's taken all 500 colors of Cosmo and all 500 colors of DMC and compared them. Not talking about that. I'm talking about professional designers producing a chart. For example, with me, I design in Cosmo, I stitch in Cosmo, but on my charts, I give you both a color code for Cosmo and a color code for DMC. And when I do that, I have gone through and very carefully chosen the DMC color that not only is closest to the Cosmo match. When it's an exact match, that's easy. Just, it's just an even Steven trade. But let's say if I have sort of an orangey pink, and over here on the DMC side, I've got a real orangey pink or real pinky orange, then I have to decide as a designer which of those 2 DMC colors stays with the spirit of the design most authentically. And so I take the time to do that. And I'm here to tell you, as a consumer, you should expect that from a professional designer. They should not just go use some random comparison where somebody else has taken those massive 2 charts and compared them. Because when they do that, chances are you're not going to have a good outcome. And this has come up recently with somebody that I know who bought a chart, chose the DMC colors that were listed, and when she was done, it really was not true to the picture that was on the publication, and she was very unhappy. And I sympathized with her, and I understood her frustration. And all I can say is, in my opinion, and I'm not going to say who the designer was, they were just not as professional as they should be. So it just, I don't want to say buyer beware, but just when you pull those threads before you leave the shop, or if you're pulling it from your stash, before you start stitching, look at them and look at the photo and say to yourself, am I going to get this result with these colors? That kind of consumer responsibility is really on your shoulders. So just be aware of that. I don't know. The most expensive part of any one of our projects is our time. And whether you're using the called for colors and you are going to get a good result, or whether you're using called for colors and you're going to end up with kind of a muddy mess, the time it took to do those 2 projects is the same. And as a consumer, I think that you deserve to get a good outcome from the time that you spend on your projects. And I guess that's the other thing too. I'm trying now on my publications to say what I have stitched with. So that's the other thing too that I think that professional designers could do as kind of a positive thing for their consumers, is to say the model photographed on the cover was stitched with blank brand, whatever the brand is. So then as a consumer, whether it was using which brand it was stitched with when there are multiple brands listed in the color code. I hope that makes sense. beginning to feel like I'm sounding like I'm whining, and I don't really mean to, because I want to talk about busting another myth. And that's the one that goes like this. Let's see. You'll never win a blue ribbon if you stitch in hand. You'll never get good results if you stitch in hand. And I just want to tell you that that is just not true. I have always felt like that I get my best results stitching in hand. Now, as I've shared with you, and again, those of you who watch me often know that after my hand surgery, I'm not able to stitch in hand. I just don't have the use of my left hand yet, which is an imperative part of stitching in hand, is to be able to hold that linen just so. And by the way, I guess maybe this is a good time to point out, for those of you that don't get stitching in hand, the fabric is stretched. It's just that it's stretched using your own fingers. I don't want you to think that we're stitching on flimsy, flopsy fabric, because that just isn't the case. But when all is said and done, I think each stitcher gets to pick the way that they are the most comfortable stitching, whether it's in hand, with a scroll frame, with embroidery hoop, whatever. So I just want to tell you that if you are sitting around the campfire and somebody's saying to you, well, you'll never win a blue ribbon if you're stitching in hand, you don't necessarily need to argue with them, but you can just say to yourself, I know that's not true. Because I want to tell you from my own experience, and maybe as I am stitching more and more with my embroidery hoop that's part of my seat frame, I am not getting as good a result with my stitching yet with that setup as I have for my years and years of stitching in hand. So I'm not comparing myself to anyone else. I'm comparing myself to me. And in both cases, I can't say that my stitching in hand is not good. That said, if a person is used to stitching on a hoop and they start stitching in hand and they don't get good results, but they still want to persevere, I would say stick with it, practice, do small things stitching in hand until you feel like that your quality is on par with what you used to get using your scroll frame or Q-snap or whatever. So I have to tell myself the same thing. I can't just say, and you would never hear me say that stitching in hoop, I'm not going to get good results. I probably will if I spent 40 years stitching that way, like I've spent 40 years stitching in hand. So, yeah, just don't believe these things when people say things like that, because they just, first of all, they don't have the authority to say it. I mean, nobody made them queen of the world, king of the world, whatever, ruler of the world. Okay, so I think that's going to be a wrap for today. So wherever you are, I hope you stitch happy, stay safe, and I'll see you next week.